It is being a predator times two or more because of the abuse of the position he was in.
A former school resource officer now accused of a years-long sexual relationship with a student that started when she was just 15 years old. He got caught after admitting to the relationship as investigators listened in on a phone call.
This is not just a stranger doing this as a predator. This is someone using a position of trust, a position that we give so much power to, the ultimate power of government, the power to deprive someone of their freedom.
Prosecutors say he groomed the girl with shocking demands, like forcing her to wear only red underwear or having sex on the hood of his car. The girl even told investigators he stared at her in the high school cafeteria and she felt he was stalking her.
Yeah, this is what you normally see with predators. You see the element of control.
This is 34-year-old Christian Linan, who up until recently worked as an SRO at Denellen High School in Marion County, Florida. He'd been with the sheriff's office there since 2016. But in 2019, Linan allegedly began a relationship with a then 15-year-old girl who only came forward years later. We sat down with Dave Aronberg, the Palm Beach County State Attorney in Florida, and he says the crime is shocking.
I mean, this is awful. We work with police all the time, and you hope that you never have a cop like this because most police officers are honorable, hardworking people who risk their lives to protect others. This guy seems more like a predator. And although these are allegations, the fact that they have the Snapchat transcript, they have the controlled calls, and they have what seems to be a very credible victim here, spells a lot of trouble for this former cop.
Linan now faces charges of lewd and lascivious battery on a juvenile victim. Aronberg says the charge fits the alleged crime.
These are charges of sexual contact with an underage person, and it's a serious charge. It's a second-degree felony punishable by up to 15 years in prison per each count. That's the maximum per each count. Since he is someone without any other prior criminal record, I think that he would get less, but it's still serious, and he would face prison time.
The charges came after an extensive investigation documented in a nearly 10-page affidavit. According to those court docs, the victim, now 19 years old, came forward to the authorities after speaking with a counselor and revealing the sexual abuse. Before that, she hadn't spoken of the relationship to anyone. She says the first time she met Linan was in 2019 when she was 15. She was riding the bus when a bomb threat came in. Linan investigated the threat, and that's where he got her contact info. He later used that number to reach out to her on Snapchat. This is a law enforcement officer, a school resource officer who was actually in the school to protect people. And I mean, he even got to know this victim because of a bomb threat. I mean, something very serious. So does that element make it even worse when he was supposed to be protecting this girl?
Absolutely. He used his position of power and trust to gain the trust of this young woman. You could say that he would never have been in this situation to board her school bus in response to a bomb threat and then get her confidence and her address and her phone number unless he was in the position he was in. And that's why this makes it so much worse. This is not just a stranger doing this as a predator. This is someone using a position of trust, a position that we give so much power to, the ultimate power of government, the power to deprive someone of their freedom, where you go through a lot of psychological tests to get to this position, to work with kids as a school resource officer, and then to turn around and to act like this. It is being a predator times two or more because of the abuse of the position he was in.
According to the court docs, the pair first met up in May or June of 2019. Linan, quote, picked her up at a stop sign down the road from her house. He drove them to a secluded area and eventually they had sex in his car. Right away, Linan warned the girl she had to keep quiet. Quote, he told her this would ruin his reputation and that they couldn't tell anyone or they would both get in trouble. He coaxed her into silence, saying, quote, she was mature for her age and he could trust her not to say anything. On top of that, the pair strictly spoke via Snapchat because the app is designed to erase messages.
But the fact that this young woman did not tell anyone at the time, and the defendant here took great pains to hide his conduct, would pick her up in his car and tell her, please, you cannot tell anyone, and then take her to his house when no one else was around. And there doesn't seem to be any other witnesses. Then, he knew what he was doing. And a guy like this, it's rare if you just do it once to one person. I wouldn't be surprised if he did it to others as well.
The meetups didn't stop then. Linan continued to meet the girl at the stop sign down the street after she told her parents she was hanging out with a neighbor friend. He even took her to his home, where they had sex on the living room couch and in the bathroom because he, quote, wanted to look at her in the bathroom mirror. Later on, she told investigators he wanted to perform oral sex on her. She recalled that she felt uncomfortable and she told him no. He told her that it was okay and that she would enjoy it. After that, he told her to start wearing red underwear whenever they met up, and she did.
Yeah, this is what you normally see with predators. You see the element of control. And the most dangerous time to leave a predator is when you break it off and the predator thinks he has lost control. Now, thankfully here, there was no accusation of any violence other than the sexual violence that's inherent with this kind of relationship, but there was no physical violence beyond that. And that's why I think that hopefully that she will be able to have a future where she could be with counselors and therapists to overcome this, because this is the kind of behavior that it happens earlier in life, and you can get PTSD and other mental ailments from it. And you just want this to be taken care of. We're so glad that she came forward, just for her sake, for her family's sake, and for the sake of others in the community, to prevent this guy from doing it again.
The girl came forward just days ago, on February 1st of this year. Before that, she'd spoken to Linan as recently as January 8th, 2024, because the pair kept up on Snapchat and with occasional phone calls. She moved away from Florida, first to New Jersey and then to Illinois, but she returned to Florida in summer 2023 to visit family. She again met up with Linan and they had sex. It was only after speaking with a therapist that she decided to come forward with the allegations. That's when investigators inquired about a controlled phone call.
Well, Florida is a two-party consent state when you do calls, but law enforcement has an exemption. Now, they traveled to Illinois for this, but the call would have taken place into Florida. So they used their authority as part of an investigation. Perhaps they got a warrant, but as part of an investigation, you do have a different ability to do this, whereas private citizens can, and it would not be used in court. So law enforcement was able to use their power to make him say things that were incriminating. And it wasn't just what he said, it's what he wrote in Snapchat, because after all, people lie, but recordings and transcripts do not.
Marion County officials traveled to Illinois to meet up with the survivor to hear more about the accusations. It was then that she reached out to Linan on Snapchat. The girl started by asking Linan about what kind of lingerie she should buy, and that spiraled into a conversation about meeting up again. She wrote, "What are you doing for spring break? They give you off?" He replied that he was off, saying, quote, "You coming down to Florida for some Girls Gone Wild deal?" As the conversation carried on, she asked Linan whether he still thinks about her. He wrote in part, quote, "Girl, if you only knew how many times I think of you. I had to force myself to stop." After that, Linan called the girl via Snapchat. She brought up their past sexual interactions, and he corroborated the information as investigators listened on.
I think the way that the investigators did their jobs was really to a T. It was perfect detective work, where they met with the victim. She was credible. And then they even flew up to Illinois, where she was living, to do a controlled call, because at the beginning, it really is a she said, he said situation. So they wanted to get the goods, and they did so by having her reach out to him on the phone and through Snapchat. And that's pretty damning information. And law enforcement officers know how to do an investigation generally, but this cop seemed to let his guard down and just gave up the ghost. I mean, the stuff that he wrote back really is going to be used against him in court. And I'd be surprised at this stage if he actually went to trial. Perhaps he'd be best served in taking a plea deal, because this looks really bad.
I mean, how could he ever combat that? It's pretty much there, black and white.
Yeah, it's tough. I'm a prosecutor, not a defense lawyer, but defense lawyers tend to get very creative with some of their arguments. They could claim entrapment, but that's not what this is. They could try to spin it to say that he was joking, but that's not going to work. So he's caught. He's, as Shakespeare said, hoist by his own petard. And I think those words will be used against him. And here's someone who was trustful of this then underage girl because she had stayed quiet so long. In fact, she didn't tell anyone in her life until she revealed all to a counselor. And good for that counselor to convince her to go to the police. And then she had the courage to go to law enforcement. She's the reason why this all went into motion. She wasn't dragged there by anyone. She went there on her own volition, spoke to a detective, and then the system worked. So kudos to the deputies who took the complaint to the sheriff. They're not rallying around this cop. This one looks like a real bad egg.
Aronberg says while it may have been nerve-wracking for the survivor to make that controlled phone call, the hardest part was to report the alleged assaults at all.
When the young woman went to law enforcement to report it, that was the biggest step. The whole thing had to be nerve-wracking for her. But I think the greatest step for her was to speak up, to actually say something after all these years. And kudos to the guidance counselor who gave her the confidence to do that. I think once you're with law enforcement and you've already taken that major step to report it, I think it's easier at that point. The hardest part is taking that first step.
During her interviews with investigators, the girl expressed feelings of love from Linan. She said he told her he was married, but that he loved her and that he would leave his wife for her. She recalled that he told her something to the effect of that they would be together and he would marry her. Court docs read, quote, "Over time, she knew what was happening between them was wrong, but he always told her that no one would believe her and that his precinct would always be on his side." She recalled feeling at one point that if she ever needed to call law enforcement in an emergency, she would rather die than ask the police to help. The girl also expressed concerns that Linan was stalking her, saying he knew personal details and would stare at her at the cafeteria in school. It's interesting that he was specifically a school resource officer, as we've been discussing, so he had access to other students. Is it possible that other people come forward or future investigations ensue?
It is possible that other people come forward because if he did this to one student as a school resource officer, who else would have been victimized? Now, we don't have any evidence yet, but this case just was revealed. And now that it's out in the open, I wouldn't be surprised if others came forward. When someone does something like this, it's usually not the first time they do it when they get caught. And you hope that other victims out there will come forward. But as a prosecutor, we only deal with evidence. And until someone comes forward and there is corroboration, prosecutors are only going to have to stick to this one case.
Some of Linan's past words could come back to haunt him, though. From a Marion County Sheriff's Office Facebook post in 2021. He wanted to focus on, quote, asking deeper questions other than how was your day with your children, which in turn leads to building healthy relationships and trust amongst each other. I mean, could those words be literally thrown back in his face?
Yes, and if you look at it now that we know everything, it really looks bad. I mean, yeah, he used his position and his authority to gain trust, and this was not a positive relationship. I mean, there's no way to spin that. So, yeah, this all looks terrible, and the sheriff had made great comments about how this hurts him to see this happening, and you'd hope that there were no red flags from colleagues and others who then ignored what was going on.
Do you think that any more charges will be added in this case? Is that possible?
It's always possible as more evidence is discovered that future charges could be added, but as of right now, these are all serious charges. He's facing years of incarceration. And if future victims speak up and come forward, then there could be more charges. But as of right now, he will not be a law enforcement officer again, and he could face severe incarceration that can keep him in prison for many more years of his life.
When Linan finally spoke to investigators, he became visibly upset. He also admitted to having sexual intercourse with the victim, but advised that since the victim was 16 or 17, she was of legal age to consent to having sex. Aronberg says all that doesn't add up.
One thing that really struck me was he spoke to his superiors, the investigators at his law enforcement agency who were investigating him. And he defended himself saying that he thought she was 16. Like, he didn't even know the law, apparently, if that's really what he thought. And who knows if that's really what he thought. But even if she was 16, that's still a crime. And she 15, 16. And so even his best argument was a betrayal of his badge, of his authority, of the trust that people in the community and in his agency had for him, and especially the trust that this young woman had for him as a school resource officer. So, I mean, this is terrible all around. Someone who actually believes that the age of consent is 16 should not be in a position of authority, or especially not a school resource officer. And even if he did think that, to take advantage of his position where he's supposed to be a mentor, he's supposed to be a role model for these kids, someone they could trust, and exploit that to abuse this young woman, pretty despicable.
Linan resigned from his position as a school resource officer and is now being held in jail without bond. We reached out to the Marion County Sheriff's Office for an interview for this story, but never heard back. Reporting for Law and Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.